financial frameworks that make you fundable, I'd like to introduce a good friend and my colleague at Reach Australia, Tom Ellis. Tom, aside from being one of the foremost knowledgeable people in how to actually fund a PropTech, how to navigate funding and finance in a PropTech, Tom is really, really good at being able to discern the difference between expensive champagne. He runs workshops on the design of puffer vests in the Melbourne weather. And he is a cigar connoisseur. So aside from all of the funding things, 3 useless bits of information that you need to know about Tom. And, of course, we've got Kylie Davis back. Give them a big round of applause, please.
Okay. Can you manage me on time, please, Pete? Yeah, okay. Sure. So, Tom, give us a little bit about your background that doesn't involve puffer jackets, cigar or champagne, and how you got into this area of PropTech funding and finance.
It's a long story that I'll shorten. For my sins, and Pete's right on some of that and probably more right than I'd like him to be. I was a banker, capital B, for a number of years and really got my entree into private equity lending through the back end of the GFC. I was co-managing a $1 billion debt portfolio and then helped launch the Bank of Melbourne brand. So I was part of a change management team with some people from Bain, Capgemini, very smart people. And then left, built a MarTech workflow startup that we sold after 18 months. That's the sort of the party line. The reality is we took some money from some people that were pretty vulturous and we got out by the skin of our teeth. So that's probably for a story over a beer. And then I worked for a family office, and if anyone's not aware, large wealthy families sort of corporatise their way of investing once they're above $50 to $100 million of deployable assets. So I worked for a Chinese billionaire for 3.5 years, flying around the world, buying and selling companies. And then I've spent the last 5 years as a corporate advisor supporting transactions. One of those clients was a business called UbiPark. We assisted them with a capital raise, and Second Century Ventures and Reach were a cornerstone as part of that. And then I've ended up spending a lot more time with Peter and the team at Reach, and coming on a couple of years now. And we've invested in 25 businesses, I think, over the last 3 years, or there's a few we haven't announced yet. That's how I ended up here.
Awesome. Well, that's about 3 questions in one, but that's cool. So we all learn best usually when we do something wrong rather than we do something right. And I think your MarTech story kind of hints at that. But what do you see when you're across the 25 Reach businesses that you've worked with, especially in the PropTech space? What are some of the key things that you've seen PropTechs do wrong that you think could very easily be course corrected?
I think there's a couple of things, and sort of picking up on the themes of Naomi and Suzette touched on, and Carolyn as well, that sort of knowing, listening to your customer. And a few people I've seen go, here's my customer, I will not move. And you go, well, here's what you're being asked for. And they go, no, I can't do that. So usually the responsiveness to customer, especially when you're trying to find that vein of enough customers that you can go deep enough in. When you're sort of more emerging, you're looking at everything and everything's a potential customer. But ignoring customers or not addressing the sort of the broader need is something I see people fall over on pretty quickly. And the other is sort of pivoting too late. So again, on the feedback to the market.
Mm-hmm. So when a PropTech is looking for funding, what are the things that you see that they need to do to make it go right?
So I think I sort of have an interesting school of thought on this, especially as a funder of companies. The best primary source of capital is customers. That if you are getting customers, then you will get external funding. Tends to be what we see. That growth rate and that sort of proving a need that people are prepared to pay for is a proof point. And I think what people can improve upon is the communication around that. If you say, hey, my forecast is X and a process is taking a few months, every month make contact with your potential investors and say, here's how we're going, we're there or thereabouts. So I think that people come into a conversation and think of it as a transaction, not a relationship. So that's probably the biggest thing I see people could improve upon.
And does that mean bootstrapping particularly, or is it more just we're winning some customers and we've set, 100 customer target and we're at 45? how are we going to hit the extra 55?
So I think a big thing for me as an investor is momentum and velocity. So going from 1 to 2, 2 to 10, whether that's capital funded or, through client funds, it's more that if you're showing someone who's prepared to pay and there's a pathway to it being profitable at a point or the data being useful at a point, we're investing early and late. So it's kind of a barbell around some of these points. But I think it's the communication around that velocity and proving that people care, or that you've explored an area and you're moving from B to B to D to C or whatever the thing is, and providing a rationale for why. Because in lieu of that, we're investing in you guys as founders and how you think, how you operate, and how the market responds to you. And probably the other thing is when things go bad, what do you do? We've got some success stories in our global portfolio, and a lot of it's when people have hit walls, and there's a few faces in here that I know, and it's not until you hit a wall that we see how people pick themselves up, and that's often when the difficult discussions happen.
So what are without naming names, although I'm sure we won't name names, without naming names, what are some of the biggest mistakes that you've seen that we can learn from?
I think it's really difficult because timing is something that people underprice. People always, misprice luck, and luck is sort of a thing where pushing hard enough for long enough, there's this great kind of image of two people digging in a mine and one gives up an inch before the diamond, the other goes through. We've probably all seen that and laughed at it, but that's the reality, that sort of tenacity as a founder to find the way through. And I think also knowing when to quit, like on a strategy, on a belief, on a hire, on a funding. There's times when you've got to get back to just looking after the core, protecting yourself as a founder, and as an investor and funder, we look to that. We look to it's a long journey. It's not one check tomorrow. It's who's going to be there in 5-10 years. So I think that's probably the thing that I'd like people to take away.
When you meet a PropTech for the first time, when they're pitching you, what do you look for? You must have a pretty good radar.
I think people often talk over me, which is no mean feat because I could talk underwater. And I think not listening is something that always gets me a bit cautious. I want to understand if that's how they're dealing with me as a potential stakeholder, how are they engaging with customers? You're probably seeing a theme here where I mention customer every 2 seconds. That's because across the global reach and second century portfolio, there's 250 plus companies, and those that we've seen over that sort of amount of data that are succeeding are listening, engaging, working with customers. So if someone's trying to force their point or tell me that I'm not understanding, I may not be, but help simplify. And a lot of the work we do is distilling complicated messages into sort of simplified dot points. Because if it's not right for me, that's fine. But we can be not right and then have a conversation. It doesn't mean that I dislike you or what have you. So I think that dialogue rather than it being one way.
We're hearing a lot today about the power of communication and relationships and the humanness of it all, as opposed to the tech side of it. What are the key pieces of advice that you give PropTechs in the Reach cohort? Does it kind of fall into key categories?
I think it's probably that's part of the secret sauce of the whole team. We've got Ebony and Pete, and we've got some support globally. And I think it would be remiss of me to distill it into a sentence in this forum, but I think it's partnership. Partnership is the big thing. So listening to each person's unique need and adapting relative to that. If we've got a business and there's a number of our cohort here today that are might be in consumer markets versus construction, like I can't give the same thing, but we talk a lot about active listening and communication. I think that's probably the biggest thing that any investor should be talking to.
When founders are looking at going down the funding path, what's the thing that they misunderstand the most, or what's the hardest to grasp?
Yeah, the model is very, very important. The economics of your business, whether what it is today or in future. As an investor, I need to understand what you believe to be true and then what I believe you believe, if that makes sense. So how much conviction can I have in your forecast? And if you go, hockey stick up and to the right, and then I go, well, all right, that means you're going to increase your customer charge from $8 to $700 per customer. Just help me bridge that So the logic that goes into a model and the discussion around it, and that's probably my banking career, it's not that the number moved from 10 to 20, it's the why. I actually care about whether it went from 10 to 20. You know, Scott, we worked together a long time ago, and you've heard me talk about that for 15 years. It's the why, because what I want to know is, do you understand the levers in your business? How does that relate to the market and what the market's telling me, us, our network? You know, who are the peers that I can lean on to go, will the market tolerate this pricing? And I think that's probably the piece that, you know, a lot more fiction's written in Excel than Word, right? Like it's
Oh, I'm keeping that.
and remember, I do buyouts for a living, so I think it's what do you hold to be true and how do you justify it? And then if we say, what if it doesn't? What does it mean? And the question I ask people is, what does failure look like? And if people go, oh, I shut the door, I tend to be less interested. You can sort of see the fire in some people, and a lot of the founders we've backed, it's a personal thing where they go, oh, no, this is my mission, or I believe in this because, or no, can't you see the market needs this? So that, you know, if it's not going to be accepted by those 10 people, there's another 1,000 behind it. And I think the depth of market, and that's what I mean by model, it's not just dollars and cents, it's the macro environment of, you know, if you get 4% of a $10 million market, I'm not that interested. If you get 4% of a $10 billion market or 2%, you know, how in a small market you can be outcompeted. In a bigger market, you know, there's other levers.
Yeah. Funding and going down the investor path is still fairly new for Australia. How what role do you think Australia, you know, our experience as Australian and some Kiwi businesses have around funding? How can we, you know, how do we compare to the US, and how can we get better at it?
So I've just been in San Diego for about a week and catching up with some of our businesses globally who've raised sort of several hundred million, and some of our Australian businesses that have raised a lot less. Australians are typically capital efficient. That's, you know, investment nerd for good at sort of doing it cheap, and sort of not experimenting as much. I think the piece that Australians struggle with is putting themselves up in lights enough to go, here's the BHAG, you know, like Naomi did this morning, getting it down to one experience a second. You know, what is that? And then how do you bridge it back to today and tomorrow? What's the crawl, walk, run of that? A lot of our US parties are kind of really clear on, here's the blue sky, here's today, I'll get, you know, the half step through your money, then I'm going to get some other money. So, you know, don't mishear that I'm saying customer funds are the only source. It's that if I believe they will come, or, you know, an investor believes it, you don't necessarily have to be viable if you can be fundable. So you can go, well, that unlocks this, or, you know, here's where the other pieces come. So the storytelling in Australia is always a bit overbaked in the technical and not clear enough on the reality of the today, tomorrow, next year. And
that comes down, again, back to that communication piece and that relationship and understanding customers and adoption.
And believability. You know, everyone sends me something saying there's a TAM of $1 trillion, or using the markets around, you know, the Australian property size. And it's kind of, that's interesting, but do you really understand where you're playing? So I think the just pausing and saying, this is where we play, we know this because, and we often trust the experiences where you see Canva and Atlassian teams get funded. If you've been around high-performing people and you understand things in the market, or you've got property experience, call that out, because there's a lot of people that have built tech, you know, to some of the points around fintech, and they've kind of gone tech first, problem later. And I think understanding and listening to customers, or you know, being able to show evidence that you can, is really important.
Cool. So last question. I know this comes up a lot. What is the ideal amount of funding to raise, and what's the right mix of shareholders and investors? Like, how do you avoid losing everything in your business?
It's a big caveat of it depends, and I won't give personal financial advice. I've never, in my experience, had anyone go, I raised too much money. No one has ever said to me, gee, I wish I had raised less. Ever. No one's ever gone, geez, we could have done it with half the amount. I think there's always more to spend on, but I think the right number of shareholders ideally is one or none. But, you know, that's kind of it's the right number to get you to the gate. Ownership is something people get hung up on, around 2%, 10%, 100%. I think it's around the mission, the value you create, and how you get there together. There's a business named Knock in the US. They were going to IPO. They're part of our broader global portfolio. It was going to be a $2 billion IPO. The founder got crushed down with 200 plus mil of debt. This is all public, so I can comment on it. And their effective equity got really heavily compressed. They were an integral part of that business. So as part of recapitalising it, they were granted a whole host of options that brought them back up to a material threshold. If you're solving a problem and you're critical to the business, there is always money to be made. I think arguing about 1% here or there versus the right parties that will back you when things are difficult. But I guess the other side of that is if you're a founder and you've got sort of sub 10% and you're looking to raise money, that starts to raise flags. If it's sort of looking for several $1 million because it's how much incentive will you as a founder have in 3, 5, 10 years, you'll hear that kind of timeline and relationship are two things I keep mentioning. And we just look for that alignment.
Awesome. So, Tom, thank you so much. You're hanging around for drinks after?
Yeah, I'll be here.
Okay, awesome. Please join me in thanking Tom Ellis.